All right, guys. One Fun Guy podcast is live with James Walker here. Before we get started on the show, I am going to share it to the group. The One Fun Guy podcast is going to be talking about wrestling factions today. But just before we start the live show, today's sponsor is going to be the Clubhouse Inc. So if you like the shirt I'm wearing, head over there. It's www.shoptheclubhs.com. As we get started with the introduction, I'm going to let James give a little bit of background about himself, and then I am going to share it into the group. The last couple lives I've done, it's just been virtual, so this is actually cool because James is in the studio with us today. So I'll let him do his introduction. We will get started, and then I will start our list from there. So while he's doing his intro, I'm just going to share the show, so don't mind me, guys.
Yeah, it's a long drive down here, Barco. All right. My name is James Walker. I've known Marco. I guess we've known each other for maybe about 25 years, but actually a little bit longer because we were actually played on opposing high schools. He played at St. Pat's, I played at Carmel. So we've been in each other's realm for about 30 years, you know. So yeah, I grew up in North Chicago, Illinois. Played Little League football for North Chicago Flames. Went to Carmel High School, played football there, wrestled, and then I got recruited to go play at Carthage, and that's where I met Marco. I think we met freshman year, and we've been friends ever since. I'm a graphic designer, I'm an artist, I'm a husband. I'm a licensed health and Medicare agent. So if you know anybody that needs Medicare help, I'm your guy. Definitely, you can give me a call. I'll give you my number in a minute. A lot of people get taken advantage of with Medicare. You know, I am very generous with my time. So my number is 414-998-3502. If you know anybody that just needs help and wants some Medicare questions answered, give me a call. But yeah, that's about it. I've been a wrestling fan since probably about 1984. And I was like 4 years old. I saw Hulk Hogan slamming Andre, and I was like, yeah, I was hooked. You know, I've been a fan ever since. And then, when I met Marco, he was a fan. And we, like he said in the intro before, we had a lot in common. We're both kind of only children, Catholic school, high school. Which is, 80s babies.
Right.
We just music, like heavy metal, movies. We've been friends ever since. So that's kind of how we all linked up.
That's so awesome, guys. So if you're following live, if you could like and share the show, that'll be great. We're going to hop right into it, guys. If we go a little bit over the hour today, I know I try to keep it to an hour mark, but we got a lot to talk about, a lot to catch up with. And then basically the show is going to be a wrestling show. So if you are a fan of professional wrestling, WWE style, this is going to be it for you guys. We're going to talk top 10 wrestling factions. Now, I didn't talk to James about this before, so I kind of wanted to keep it more organic. However, we will start the list off pretty soon in a minute. But what we're going to do is I'm going to give him what I thought was the criteria of what we should do. So I noticed I posted a little bit of a Easter egg in my last post about the show, right? So if you follow wrestling, you would have gotten those references. So I think I put in there, are you ready? With a question mark, which kind of gives it, I think I said it's going to be too sweet. So if you kind of know wrestling, you know where I was going with that. Right. So those are kind of little subtle Easter eggs. Then James posted a picture of different groups, and I was like, the three that I saw aren't on my list, and I'll tell them why in a minute. So let's get into it. So do you want to start with your number 10, or do you want me to start my number 10? And we'll kind of go from there.
You start.
Okay, so I'll start. So I noticed that he had the New Day, the Fabulous Freebirds, and there was somebody else in that picture. And I excluded those from my list because I figured a faction was going to be 4 or more. So I will give a honorable mention to those wrestlers that I just mentioned. So the Freebirds, the New Day, and the Shield will all get honorable mentions. However, I did not put them on my list because I went with groups of 4 or more. So I'll start with my number 10, and that is going to be Raven's Flock. And I will give you the reason before that. So I tried to pick as many factions that were in more than one wrestling organization and had numerous runs in different brands of wrestling. So Raven's Flock was obviously started in ECW. It transferred over to WCW, so that's kind of where my head was with that. They did have the Raven's Flock. I think only had one champion, and it was Raven. I don't think Saturn might have been
Wasn't it
like
Raven's
a TV.
Nest in one of their promotions too?
That was TNA after, but it wasn't the Flock. That was because he wasn't when he did his TNA run for just that short stint. It was him, and I think Kidman was the only other one with him, and I think that was kind of. And then they just recruited some other guys. But as far as that goes, that's so my mindset with the factions was that if we could do it with 4 or more, so that's kind of where my mindset was. So that's kind of how I started the list off. So with me being that regard for it, that was my number 10 was Raven's Flock. So if you are an old school ECW fan or a WCW fan, or even a TNA fan, because he did have a little run with those guys, you would know that. So that was my number 10. So Raven's Flock was my number 10.
Well, knowing how similar Marco and I think, our lists are probably going to be fairly the same. Because my number 10, also Raven's Flock.
Okay,
go figure.
So,
for me, my criteria with factions is like, okay, did they put butts in seats? Did people pay to see them? Did they have a lot of merchandise? Did they have champions? Did they eventually have guys that branched out to become world champions? So that was kind of my thing. So yeah, Flock, I thought Raven's Flock was great. Raven was a great character. I wish they had really let him run with the Flock in WWE, but they didn't. Because the stuff he did in ECW, the stuff even in WCW when he had guys like with Van Hammer in there with him, and Perry Saturn and Lodi. He had a lot of guys, like the WCW Flock. That was a great faction. So yeah, number 10 for me is the Flock as well.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on, for my number 9 is going to be the Heenan family. Now, he had right. So the reason I went with that is because that was never Scotty. What's up, my buddy? Keep watching. You'll see where they end up on the list.
We'll get to the Horsemen.
So they're higher up. Probably very high on both of our lists,
right?
If not the highest. So anyways, the Heenan family I did because of the way that it ran with the people that were in and out of it. It wasn't necessarily one group, but with the time he had with $1 Million Man, King Kong Bundy, the Samoans. I mean, everybody who was anybody in basically 80s wrestling
heels,
right? We're in the Heenan family. So all the way up until Andre the Giant, I think one of the later ones that he ran with, and that kind of thing. But the reason I put them lower on the list only was because of the fact it wasn't necessarily a quote unquote faction through the long run. It was kind of a thing. So
it rotated a lot.
Right. So getting in and out of that is why they're low. But the Heenan family was my number 9. So
all right. My number
What's
9,
up, Joe?
My number 9 is the Dangerous Alliance. WCW. The early days of Paul Heyman, when he was Paul E. Dangerously, he had the mullet, he had the cell phone, he was hitting people in the head with the cell phone. Yeah, I love the Dangerous Alliance. You had Rick Rude in there. You had stunning Steve Austin with the long blonde hair. Medusa was in that crew. Who else did he have in there? I probably should have wrote that down. But yeah, the Dangerous Alliance, he had a lot of good guys. And the thing is, like, I think in some of these lower ranked factions, a lot of these factions were basically like, they necessarily weren't really considered they were factions, but they were more
they didn't know it, I guess.
They didn't really. It wasn't it was a manager that had his group of heels. It was a manager that had his group of guys. So yeah, by all intents and purposes, it was a faction, but it was basically this manager had his group of guys that were wrestling for different titles here and there. So that's kind of what managers were back in the day,
right?
And like you said, like the Heenan family had his crew. Dangerous Alliance had his crew. Cornette had a crew. That was an extension of the Midnight Express.
Yeah. So like I said, I think the way we didn't, normally when we did our tag teams, we had a conversation about how we were going to do it and like how it was going to basically run. number of people in seats, how many champions they had across the board, how many championships they won, and that's kind of how we narrowed it down to basically like, so with this one here, I'm like, let's not talk about it. We'll talk about it right live on the show. So we didn't, other than the fact we said we're going to do top 10 factions, we could have went any way with it. So that's kind of how we were about it. So this is the first time we're talking about our list now. So at my number 8, I did kind of 2. I did aces and eights, and I did beer money, which were kind of like in the thing. The only reason why I did that is because they kind of stemmed between the TNA and the Impact Zone, and they had a lot of the same players in them. So when I went to the route of like my headspace of where I was at with that, I was like, I didn't want to put them any higher on the list, but I didn't want to exclude them from the list, only because one of the guys, well, technically 2 of the guys that were in there for such a short time are higher up on my list in a different faction that they were a part of. But because they ran with it so well, and it got a lot of interest in wrestling at the time when wrestling wasn't interesting anymore, this was kind of like the one that kind of made it cool again to watch wrestling when they didn't have any groups. So just for the fact of putting rear ends in the seats and making money with a storyline, that's why I put them on the list. And that's kind of how low they are in terms of that. So,
was that 8?
Yeah.
Okay, so my 8 got switched. Like I think I switched my 7 and 8 on the ride down here. So my 8, I'm going to go with the Freebirds. I know Marco says it's got to be 4 or more, but for me, like I think 3 guys is a crowd, so that's a faction to me.
So, again, that's where I was with that because I removed the Shield, the Freebirds, and New Day off my list. They were all up there, and they were all in my 10. And I'm like, but if you consider them the way that they operated, kind of especially the Freebirds and the New Day, where they basically were like a tag team, but they used their third as a staple. Mm-hmm. So I removed them from my list, and that's why I gave them the honorable mention, because the Shield necessarily didn't do that, but the way that it was with how I thought my list was going to be is I removed them and actually put factions which were 4 or more. So they were on my list initially, and if you go through it, you'll see I wrote down pretty much everybody, and then I narrowed it to a top 10. So,
well, see what I like about the Freebirds is the Freebird rules. How they had a tag team, and that any combination of the 3 guys in a duo could defend that belt. That was one of the coolest things back in the day about the Freebirds. Now, and with the Freebirds, you know, I mean, they were heels, you know, they had the stars and bars, you know, but it was Southern wrestling, so that's their thing, you know. I won't get into that. But as far as the Freebirds, my favorite incarnation was Michael PSA's Terry Bam Bam Gordy and gorgeous Jimmy Garvin.
What's up here?
That was the trio that I liked the best, you know. Because even Garvin was great, you know. He had the big curly perm, and he came out with the sparkling vest.
Well, yeah.
Like,
and then remember when they first started, they had those old cheesy white jackets that just had the Freebirds on.
It was
like just a better time in wrestling. Like no production, no anything. It was just
with the loaded gun bag.
Yeah,
he threw it in, pow, and he tracked the guy with it. Yeah, that was great. You know, the Freebirds, when they started, they were only 19 years old when they started.
It's crazy to think, right, that, you know, a lot of those guys, you know, back in the day, they left high school and they went to wrestling. Now, a lot of that back in the South especially, those were rooted, right? Mm. So you knew that you were going to be a wrestler because that's all there was to do.
Yeah.
So, like, if you didn't make it in, like, I don't want to say real sports, but, like, if you didn't make it in traditional sports, wrestling was your fallback, you know. So
even football players, because the money wasn't big like the NFL is now.
Right.
A lot of those guys in the off season,
sure.
The Big Cat Ernie Ladd was a football player.
Right.
You know, Fred showed up at WrestleMania. 2 guys were supplementing income.
Right?
Yeah,
you know,
they were supplementing income to make money doing football. You know?
Right. So that's where I am. So number 7. Now I had a discussion with a buddy, and we kind of came through where we were at mind space wise. They might be higher on some people's list, but I think when I go up my list, you'll understand why. But for number 7, I had the Bloodline. So I think that, like, now, the way that wrestling is now, I think that as far as storylines go, they're obviously better written, right? Because back in the day, you had wrestlers writing stories for wrestlers. Now you have TV productions, TV assistants. You have actual people that write scripts for movies. They're writing wrestling stories now, right? So the stories don't come from wrestlers anymore. They come from people that write reality TV shows, and they're professionals. Like, that's what they do. So back with when the bloodline started, and you kind of had all the the Islanders come back into the thing, and they were like, well, our uncles, Yokozuna, and our uncles, are the Islanders, and we have. So the way that they went into creating it was awesome, right? Because they used their real family in a story in wrestling that I think has been the best faction of modern time, right? So I wanted, in theory, they should have been higher because they had all the belts and everything, but there's just better ones to come. So I think that's why they're lower on my list. But on number 7, I had the Bloodline.
All right, my number 7 is Sierra, Hotel, India, Echo, Lima, Delta, The Shield. I thought The Shield was one of the best trio factions there was. Like, you had 3 young guys coming out of NXT, or no, was it Florida Championship Wrestling?
Yeah, they were.
Yeah. Either way, whatever. They came out, and they came out gunning, and then they were just, and they put 3 belts on both guys right away. I think you had what? Roman was U.S. champ, and then you had Moxley. What was he called back then?
What was he?
Dean Ambrose.
Dean Ambrose.
That's funny. My 10-year-old nephew keeps calling him Dean Ambrose. Like, no, he's Moxley now. But he's only been alive for 10 years, so he only knows WWE.
Sure. And
I tell him all the time, "Oh God, kid, you were born 20 years too late." Anyway, so that he's kind of my wrestling watching buddy now. But and Seth Rollins, like when they were the Shield, like they were just dominating everybody, And I loved when they finally put them against the Wyatt family, because it was like three guys, okay, but then they killed that feud too early,
right?
But I put the Shield up there because they're and now they're all world champions,
right? So the Shield did something very unique that really hadn't been done in a long time, is because when you have a faction or a tag team, when they come out in identical clothing and they come out wearing the same stuff, you kind of know that they're together, right? Mm-hmm. So that puts them apart. But the Shield coming in from the crowd, being one with being like the underdog, being like they did something that was more unique than anybody has done in the past, at least in my opinion, the way that they presented themselves, because it was like they were fighting for the people, if that makes sense. Like they were one within them, and they let them roll with that. And most people don't really like that. Like they don't want to see, but they made that work. And if you take them individually, like what they've done in their careers post the Shield, I don't think you have 3 bigger talents right now in wrestling than those guys. So again, they were honorable mentions for me. They would have definitely been on my list. I just let them go down lower for that reason. But having the Shield, that would have been exactly where they would have been with me, and the Freebirds would have been there as well. So
I think the Shield's theme music was really good too.
It was awesome.
Guitar riff.
Yeah. Everything about it was great.
When you heard that Sierra Hotel, and then the beginning, all the
right, and then the Shield would break through the stone. I mean, of course,
like that was nice. So
that and even till this day, if you're a wrestling fan, like Moxley still does that, right? With the Blackpool Combat Club now, he comes down through the people. So it's kind of the adage to it. And then I don't know if you guys saw it the other night when Seth Rollins did it, when he was actually wearing the Shield gear just to get under Roman's skin. But it's kind of cool, because it made everybody think. And it's funny because if you just started watching wrestling a year ago or 2 years ago, you'd have no idea who the Shield were. Like you realize like what they did and where they're at now. With Rollins and I slipped Roman being number 1 and number 2 in the company right now, and then Moxley being wherever he's doing, that is awesome. So the Shield would have been up there with me as well. I just, like I said, I just excluded them as factions. So my number 6 is going to be Team 3D, and so you had the Dudleys in ECW, and they had a wide variety. How did they have 7 people, right, or 8 people in that one?
The Dudleys. The Dudleys, right. Team 3D was their faction.
Well, the Dudleys, the team, the whole thing, right? So all across the board, right? So you got the Dudley boys, the way that they did it in ECW was they basically had a bunch of guys and they all wore their tie-dye stuff, right? So it was awesome, right? Then ECW kind of ends and they bring it into the WWE, and they kind of switched their genre around. But their early run in WWE still had the 4 of them. So you still had Devon, Bubba Ray, Spike, and
Big Dick.
Well,
was it Big Dick or no?
well, he was in ECW, and then you had Sign Guy Dudley. You had, because there was the girl, but who's the blonde, the tall, skinny one, that wore the tight mini skirts and the high boots, that was doing the 3D thing with them.
Stacey Keebler.
Stacey Keebler.
Yeah.
So the reason I picked the Dudleys is because from ECW to WWE to TNA, they had that going all the way across, and they always had guys that were in them. So the Dudleys, obviously, they were number 2 on my top 10 tag teams. I think you had them as number 1.
Oh, yeah, I had them
so
number 1.
just because of what they did and what they were able to accomplish with 2 guys that were just, fun to watch, fun to be around, they transitioned that throughout the course of their career. And that's why I said with Aces and Eights and, Beer Money, with them being in those kind of things, like, they ran with that. And, and Bubba Ray always brought Devon back in whenever he wanted to do it. So even though Devon was only part of Aces and Eights for such a short amount of time, he brought that mentality back to that group. And that's kind of where, I had to put the Dudley Boys, Team 3D, and everything that they've done as a faction, crossing decades now of fans. And you just can't, what they've done for the business and what they've done. And, Bubba's such a great heel. And, me and James were talking about this earlier with the breaking kayfabe, which is basically keeping it as a, a secret and having them come out. But, like, when you look at them outside of the wrestling, they're awesome dudes, right? But when they get on TV, like, especially with Bubba Ray, he's probably the most hated guy in wrestling right now. But it's awesome because that's what he built, right? He says it. And even when he went on Stone Cold's podcast and they were joking around with it, he's like, that role just fit me. But, that was the great thing about the Dudleys is that, like, they could be good, which is babyface, or bad, heel, and you still cheered for them because they were just cool guys. Like, they were relatable. So that's why I put the Dudleys at number 6.
Now, I believe in an alternate universe somewhere where we actually went and became professional wrestlers after college.
Right.
We had an epic feud with the Dudleys.
Yeah, right.
Black guy and Italian guy.
Because
right? it would have matched up perfectly.
Right there, right. We could have done it.
All right, so my number 6 is pretty much the new generation ripoff horseman of Evolution. Triple H, Randy Orton, Batista, and Ric Flair. I thought, now granted, this was basically Triple H having his 4 horseman fantasy, but Triple H being one of the greatest heels of all time in wrestling, and basically handpicking Batista and Orton, and then having Ric Flair as the veteran. It was almost like past, present, future.
Yeah.
And they all ended up, obviously they're all world champions. They're all probably Hall of Famers. And I think Evolution was just a great group, but you could tell they were definitely leaning on the horse,
sure.
wearing the suits and the shades,
nice
and like coming out of limos, and it's just like, and it's so funny because Ric Flair is going to live that horseman lifestyle forever. But it's just funny, you see them getting out of cars with women, and it's like, Triple H, aren't you married?
Right.
Yeah. So it's like, all right, so it's just like, but yeah, I thought Evolution is probably my number 6. Like, they were a team you love to hate, and Randy Orton's always been one of my favorite wrestlers, especially because he's in our age group and generation. So, like, that guy's one of the smoothest wrestlers I've ever seen. Like, that man just does not make mistakes in the ring. Batista was just jacked to the gills, and he was a good character, now he's a Hollywood movie star and actually a pretty good actor too.
Yeah, Batista's
pretty good roles.
Right.
Like he's not doing like just action movies and musclehead roles. Like he's playing serious, rounded characters.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, look at Batista. He's lost a boatload of weight.
Yeah, and he's still in great shape, and he's still, and again, he's just a hard worker.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. What is that? That one movie he plays like a nurse. Like, I guess you can't be 290 pounds yoked and play a nurse.
Exactly. And then but yeah, so I'll leave this discussion for as we get closer to our numbers as they increase in the list, because if you notice a trend with a lot of these groups and factions, you see the same characters kind of hopping in and out of them. So if you kind of know where I'm going with this as I get close to my number 1, I guess you'll see where my mind space is with it. But as we're breaking the top 5 now, getting closer to the list, at number 5, I have the Hart Foundation. And the only reason why I did that is because you have... Now, I know, take how you feel about Bret Hart and Anvil and Davey Boy and whatever.
Like
right.
Bret Hart,
So the thing with it is that the way that they were as characters back then, right? You didn't know that they were all related and that they were siblings in real life based on marriages and wives and sisters and things like that. So I always thought that that was kind of cool that, you know, Bret obviously rose to the top and he kind of took everybody with him. But you had Davey Boy, you had Jim Anvil. And then the craziest thing is that, like, even going into when Bret left the company, right, after the whole incident with Shawn Michaels, and they were like, oh, well, they knew Bret was going to leave and he was going to take the belt with him. And that was, you know, Vince had to stop it. And, you know, the whole, you know, screw job in Montreal, right? Like, everybody knows about that, right?
Stories in wrestling, too.
So, however, when Bret left, you still had the rest of the Hart Foundation in the WWF at the time. And they all managed to leave and go over to WCW with Bret and pick it up right where they left off. Mm-hmm. So I thought that, like, just by that alone, having those guys and those characters in it, because I was always a Jim Anvil Neidhart fan. Like, I just kind of liked his approach to wrestling and the way he was, you know, and that kind of crazy, kooky, but, like, you always heard of the stories about how nice of a guy he was. And you're like, shot put thrower, you know, and a football player. So, you know, as kind of how that is, you know, how you feel Bret Hart or not, you know, and how you, like, what those guys did for wrestling and how they did it, and just the transition of, you know, how they went from, you know, being hated in WWF to being loved in WWF to then being hated again to picking it up in WCW where they were loved and then hated and then loved. Like, it's just kind of a great, you know, group of guys that, you know, obviously with losing Owen and Davey Boy, you know, and now, you know, Jim the Anvil, it's just kind of, but what they did for wrestling at the time as a group and kind of always having the I have your back no matter what. A lot of guys will always say that in the wrestling business, right? Oh yeah, but when something happens or it turns into a storyline gone wrong or something happens, they will not go and jump promotions with their friends. They'll stay in where they're at because that's where the money is. All of those guys in the Hart Foundation all left. Yeah, they all went and followed.
They're a family.
I get it. So,
yeah.
So that's why they're my number 5. So like I said, whether you like Bret or whether you hate him or, you know, whether, you know, you think, but I think what they did for wrestling and that group of people, you really couldn't have it, you know, in my opinion. You know, they probably might have been a little bit lower on the list. Like, I maybe could have moved some guys around, but I just kind of think that, you know, for time and place and for what it was, the Hart Foundation is my number 5.
All right. So, you know, he knows I hate the Hart Foundation. So I just don't like it. But my number 5, the Bloodline. I think the Bloodline is probably one of the best factions going right now. I mean, this Bloodline story is going on for almost 4 or 5 years now. Almost,
yeah. From
you got Roman being the long reigning champion in modern era. I would like to see him break Hulk Hogan's record, but I'd also like to see Cody finish that story. You know, but I always like, and as you'll see when I get to when these factions start getting up to the top 5, I like seeing factions when everybody's holding gold. You know, the Horsemen kind of set that standard when everybody had a championship. And that's what the Bloodline did. You had Roman had his 2 world belts. Well, what was the WWE belt and the Universal spot, and they combined them. And then you had both Uso brothers with both tag team belts. You know, and I've never liked the idea of having 2 world champions in the company, no matter what it is. So like having 2 tag team belts, even though NWA they did the U.S. title and the world title. That makes sense because that makes it a different level. When we have 2 tag team champions, I'm like, no, just you know,
it's hard.
You don't have enough tag teams, you know. And having 2 world champions has always been ridiculous to me. Like, it just makes no sense.
Well, they try to break the brand, but then they still are under the same umbrella. Like, just split together.
Like,
if you're going to split,
it's like, so
like make it.
But the thing is, like, you have 2 different brands. It's like, who's the world champion?
Right.
You know. And it's like, and the world belt has always been second fiddle to the WWE title, except for when Triple H held it on Raw. Right. He was doing the Evolution because he wanted to hold the same world title belt that Ric Flair held back in NWA days. So he made it number 1. But I'm getting off on tangent.
No,
with Bloodline, that when you see that image when they all had belts, when you had, you know, both Uso brothers with both titles, Roman had both the world titles, and I'm just like, yeah. And then having Paul Heyman as the mouthpiece, like
right,
Bloodline.
It doesn't get any better.
Yeah, Bloodline's a good story.
Like I said, I think that the last probably 3 to 4 years. When I, because obviously I had the bloodline at number 7, just for the reasons of all the foremost people that we're going to talk about coming up next. But when you have champions across the board, like, it doesn't get any better than that. And I think they've been the most dominating and fascinating thing in wrestling in the past couple of years. Like, everybody focuses on the bloodline, and it's great to see that because they deserve it. But like I said, the bloodline is a great story because it goes beyond wrestling, right? It's actual family. All these guys' dads and uncles and grandfathers were all in the business. So it just makes sense. So it's kind of like the culmination of it is coming up, I think, which they could extend this longer. I mean, if they want to, they can. But, I think it's just to the point now where, it's just such a great thing. I don't think anybody wants to see it go away. I don't really want to. So,
well, after last night, when Roman and Rock had that acknowledge me moment,
right.
I'm like, ooh, that's
so here we go, right? So
some breakup right there.
But again, the business is all about money, right? And it's how much you can sell and how much you can make. So what the fans want to see isn't always what's best for money and what they're going to do. So as a wrestling fan, you kind of understand that, but like, this is something where, a lot of times things abruptly end and you're like, why did they end it? They could have kept going and going and going. But there's other stories, characters, and things that they need to build. So if you're a fan of the wrestling business, you understand why they're doing it and the way they're going about it. But as a fan, you're kind of like, don't stop. Like, don't, the steamrolling can keep going. But I agree that the Shield has been phenomenal, and Bloodline, sorry. They're awesome.
Yeah, I'm glad they finally got Roman right, because Roman was floundering. He was champion,
right?
Nobody liked it, and they tried to force him as a face, and it's like it just wasn't working. But when they got him to turn heel,
that was it.
That was license to print money,
right? Man. That was it.
His money is a heel.
Yeah, exactly. You're 100% right. So you did mention something, which is why the next groups that we have, I think, are going to be on the list for the reasons they're on the list. But having multiple belts and having people hold titles and running with that. So my number 4 is going to be the Bullet Club / the Elite. And the reason I say that is because they might not be popular into what's going on as relevant in the United States as they are in Japan. But if you look at the Bullet Club from their inception back when Finn Balor started it, they've always had the World Championship, whatever U.S. belt or whatever New Japan calls it. I think they're U.S. champions. They've held that, and the tag titles have all been on the Bullet Club, even though they circle members through in and out of it, going to different promotions and guys getting signed and moving up and, increasing their monetary gains and, their sublet. But the Bullet Club itself has always been dominating in that field, that they transcend wrestlers now into places that have been, miles and worlds apart. But the Bullet Club in itself always did that. They always were the champion, tag team champions, whether it was Intercontinental or U.S. champion, whatever New Japan had their belts at that time. They were open weight champions. They were all in the Bullet Club, and they all had belts together. So when they took pictures and they would promote it, even when social media was in its infancy, the Bullet Club was there with all their belts, and they would throw it in everybody else's face.
Bullet Club been around that long?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That was Finn Balor was, I think, 2006.
Yeah, see, I don't really get to follow New Japan. Not especially not modern New Japan, like old school stuff when they were cross promoting with old WWA. So you had Muda and Liger and them guys and Shono. But yeah, I'm not as familiar with the Bullet Club, but I mean, they've been around. I've seen T-shirts everywhere. I remember when I first saw a T-shirt, I'm like, what the hell is a Bullet Club? It was like Hot Topic or something. That was
exactly it. That's how Vince got noticed by them, because people were wearing Bullet Club stuff to WWE events. And Vince got on the line and says, why are they wearing who is this Bullet Club? Like, why are they doing it? And they're like, well, they signed a deal with Hot Topic. And Vince was like, well, why didn't we sign that deal? Well, that was their kind of middle finger to the rest of the wrestling industry. And Vince banned them from, you couldn't wear Bullet Club stuff at WWE shows.
How the biggest wrestling promoter in the world has no clue what goes on outside of his company.
I get it.
That blows me out of the water. Like, how are you that, like, obviously at one point in time he did pretty, because he saw ECW and then that's how he took all that and made the attitude there.
Sure.
But it's just the idea that, like, but it's almost like once he became the #1 show in town, it's like he just ignored everything outside. Right. And it's like, dude, you're not the only guy that has good ideas at wrestling.
And
it's just weird to me.
And like I said, when you see these factions, right? So if you noticed, it was circa around like 2017. Finn Balor got a little ballsy and started wearing Balor Club stuff, right? So everyone was like, everyone's like, what's Balor Club? Well, Finn Balor started the Bullet Club, and they couldn't wear Bullet Club stuff in, so it was kind of like the I see you, but I don't see you type thing. So Vince ended that real quick, if you notice.
Even the Judgment Day is kind of a little
short
offshoot of
correct.
the Bullet Club.
But then you see, like, you'll notice, like, Gallo and Anderson, like, they jumped around the promotions and they would start wearing Bullet Club stuff. And so it doesn't follow. But the Bullet Club started off of a group I have further up on the list. So we'll talk more about that when we hit that group.
Well, I've seen Gallows and Anderson wearing Gallows and Anderson shirts, but it's in the font of
right.
Bullet Club.
Correct. Yeah.
All right. So my number 4 is it's very similar to what the Dangerous Alliance was, but this is the faction by the greatest manager of all time, Bobby Heenan, the Heenan family. I think the Heenan family was one of the greatest heel factions. It was almost like it was a faction completely made just to take down Hulk Hogan. They did something similar with the Dungeon of Doom in WCW
sure.
with Sullivan. But like Heenan was he's a great manager. He had a bunch of big jacked up heels that couldn't talk, so you stuck them with Bobby Heenan, they became instant stars because Bobby Heenan had the mouthpiece. He could talk. I mean, he was quick witted. I love the Heenan family. He had Haku. Harley Race was in there.
Orndorff, King Kong Bundy, Andre the Giant. I mean, everybody who was everybody in
Hercules
the 80s.
And Paul with the Power and Glory.
Yeah.
Hercules and Paul Roman.
Everybody who was a wrestler in the 80s that needed a little bit of push, they would put him with Heenan. He would put him over, and they would basically become mega heels under him, and then they would either stay the heel or they would turn babyface. But it was all Heenan, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't the wrestler. They were struggling either, like James said, they couldn't, they had a hard time talking or cutting promos. They had a hard time with their athleticism because some of them were big dudes, that were just awkward. But when they went with Heenan, like, he made it work. And so it was his brainchild to do it. But, like, he extended those guys' careers because without him, they would have been in and out.
And that's a lost form as the manager in wrestling. You got Heyman, but who else do you have, really? And I think they need to bring a lot of managers back. That's one thing I do like about AEW. You do see some managers around, like Prince Nana from Ring of Honor. But yeah, that's what you needed. Like when you had a big, like that's with Brock Lesnar. Like he can talk now,
right?
But he's been in business for 20-some years, almost 20
sure.
years. But when he first started, he needed Paul Heyman as his mouthpiece. When you have these big guys that can't talk, you need to put them with a manager. And I think the only guy Heenan ever had that could talk for himself was Rick Rude. Mm-hmm. And he didn't eat Heenan. Yeah. But I think if they didn't put Heenan with him, Rick Rude might have became a face.
Right.
Because he was so good on the mic. The guy was built phenomenally, and I think he would have probably been a face if they had to put him with Heenan.
Rick Rude is probably one of the more anomaly pro wrestlers that you have because, number one, he was a good speaker. Mm-hmm. Number two, he was charismatic. Number three, he had a great physique. And number four, the icing on the cake was the fact that he could wrestle, right? Mm-hmm. He actually was able to put moves together and make it. And so they just had a big thing the other day because I don't know if you remember, I'm kind of on a tangent with Rick Rude, but he put Jake the Snake's wife on his trunks, right? So he broke every rule in the book, right?
Gyrating.
So he's doing his I'm Simply Ravishing with another guy's wife on his trunks. Now, obviously, it was planned, and they knew it, right? So obviously, but the storyline, you couldn't do that without Rick Rude. Like, it took one guy to be able to do that, to basically put Jake the Snake as a baby face who was a monster heel, and he did one little act, and all of a sudden you had 30,000 people now hate you, and 30,000 people love the heel that they just hated a week before.
Right.
You could not do that in wrestling now, and it took those two guys, and if they didn't have Rick Rude, that would have never happened. And so it just goes to show you like what guys can do when they're under the tutelage of people and they learn about the business and they appreciate the business, which is why the purists always argue that, looking at the fact that you are there in the promotion that you're in, time and place.
And I think Jake the Snake really sold his pissed offness,
his hatred, right?
Because like when he was throwing so much punches, those punches didn't look worked.
Yeah,
remember he was throwing shots at Rick Rude, and it was like, whoa, I think he's really connecting. Like he really sold like I'm pissed off. You are messing with my
Right.
wife, dude. Like, like most men would be.
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
So it's, but again, going back to the Heenan family, like I said, I had them lower on my list only because of the fact that it was kind of like a circle, like almost a tornado.
Yeah.
Like Heenan was kind of at the very tip of it, and you just kind of bring in guys. But again, that speaks mounds for Bobby Heenan. I know a lot of people in the wrestling business they never appreciated him, for more than just being a commentator. But what he did for wrestlers in the ring could not be matched by anybody else.
He was a great worker in the 70s too.
Right. But just for what he did as a manager and what he did as a commentator, he's probably the most underappreciated guy in the wrestling business. And a lot of people forget about him, but what he did can't be surpassed. I think
most people in the know.
No, right.
I acknowledge Bobby Heenan as one of the greatest managers of all time. Like from when he was managing Bockwinkel,
right.
Back in the AWA, So yeah.
So
Heenan was great.
So like I said, our lists are similar. We said that before that we were going to have, we think alike. We have this.
Our top three is going to be the same.
I'm pretty much sure. So the order might be different, but for my number 3 is DX. So obviously for what they did, time and place, right? You had an organization that was being dominated by another organization, and they were losing for 80-something weeks straight, and you have 3 people that said, hey, listen, we can do this. And if it wasn't for Sergeant Slaughter, none of that would have ever happened. So kudos to Sergeant Slaughter for calling them degenerates.
Right.
Because if that promo never happened, that might have never, Shawn Michaels might have never turned to Triple H and said, we are degenerates. We're Degeneration X. Who knows what, if that didn't happen, we don't know. But it did, and thank God for it, because DX and what they did was just awesome. I mean, just having the characters they did and the comedic side of wrestling actually came out, because it's always been a secret in the wrestling business. You always want people to break character, right? If they're that big, strong, tough guy, with The Undertaker, that was the big thing. Like, how do we get him to smile? How do you... Those guys did it
try to break it
on a weekly basis.
They
made everybody break. You could not watch DX and not laugh. It was great.
He would sit there and do like,
right. And it was, and they broke everybody. It wasn't just The Undertaker. It wasn't just Stone Cold. It wasn't just the commentators. They broke Vince. They broke everybody. They were just a group of guys that in that kind of realm that they were in, you were just kind of there. And I don't think, obviously the 2 groups that are above them for a reason, but DX is obviously DX. I mean, you can't,
They're in my top 3. They're my number 2. But one thing about DX is we were a little older when DX came out, so we were what? We were late high school, early college, so we were pretty much grown. But just imagine how many suspensions and detentions middle schooler kids got.
They're getting them now. People are still doing those. You get that.
I was scared about
now. You get that.
I had little cousins and some of their friends talking about, oh yeah, man, I got detention for saying
Kyle.
Suck it to the teacher.
Right? Yeah.
You're in 6th grade. You can't say that.
Are you ready? Ready for what? To suck.
I just can imagine
it's great,
being a middle schooler or a grade schooler when DX was out. I'm like, and I see why a lot of parents had issues with that era of professional wrestling, because it's for us as being late teens, early 20s, it was great.
You couldn't
for
duplicate
kids,
that.
It's whoa, that's a bit much.
For storylines, for language, for what you saw. I mean, look at Val Venus, right? He couldn't do anything now. But you got a guy in the middle of a ring that claims he's a porn star, has these girls scantily clad already, taking even more off, and as a 17, 18-year-old kid, you're like,
and he has the trunks
keep going, don't stop.
Down his crotch.
So I mean, that was a different, but I mean, DX basically saved the WWE. If it wasn't for them, it might have actually folded or got close to folding. Austin, right? So, and The Rock probably, I'm not saying,
Rock was better though.
If you didn't have those guys, it might have collapsed. So,
my number 3 is, they're kind of like the OG of factions. That was the 4 Horsemen. And not just any 4 Horsemen. It was Arn, Tully, Flair, and Wyndham. I think that was the best incarnation of the 4 Horsemen. And it started out as with Arn, Ole, Tully, and that was a good one too. But Ole was a little older,
right?
And he was kind of on the decline. But I think the decline. Once they got Barry Windham, the 4 Horsemen were running big time. And they all 4 of them always had belts. from the time when it was, Arn and Ole were tag champs, Tully was TV champ,
Right.
and you had Flair as world. But then when you got to the when Wyndham showed up, Arn and Tully became tag champs, and then Wyndham was the U.S. champ and Flair was the world champ. And like that, yeah, the Four Horsemen, like they were they were the epitome of a heel faction. And what's crazy is the Arn and Tully went to WWE under and joined the Heenan family and were the Brainbusters, so they still were kind of took that horseman
mentality.
Yeah, they took that horseman swagger over to the Heenan family and were tag team champions in WWF.
And so obviously most of the people watching this are probably going to be wrestling fans, but the reality is that in the business, the one thing you want to do is be a bad guy and get cheered. If you can do that, you've won. They call it getting over, right? So you can get guys to do that. The Horsemen were basically that, right? They were bad guys, but the girls loved them, right? Ric Flair would come on as a heel and people would start cheering. And it's like, and this is in the late 70s, early 80s when this was like taboo, right? So you get a lot of that mentality with the way that Ric Flair was, with that swagger and that personality. And I mean, the Four Horsemen they're higher on my list, obviously. And I think I've said this throughout the week, so it's no secret, but the Horsemen were my number one, so I'll just say it. But yeah, so I mean, having these groups, in here is really kind of second to none, especially with the way that, they basically, if it wasn't for them, you wouldn't have any of the other groups we mentioned. So we'll go to number two.
Okay.
So I kind of have, obviously my number two is the NWO, but I kind of threw in the red version, the black version, and the Click all together, which kind of goes into the DX thing because they were all friends in real life. The NWO, you had Scott Hall and Kevin Nash who were friends with Shawn Michaels and Triple H. So they were doing their things separately, but kind of like, I'm pretty sure they were working off of each other. So, I mean, the NWO, as far as I can remember, I was just before high school, so I think I was 13 when that happened, and you couldn't go anywhere and not see NWO shirts. Like, even before the red version started, and then you had, the LWO, the Latino World Order, and all the stuff. Like, I mean, Rey Mysterio just wore an LWO shirt the other day. That all stemmed from the NWO and the breakouts of WCW.
Weird, though, how he's LWO now, but
Right.
in WCW he was fighting against the LWO.
Yeah.
Like, what?
So, it's bizarre, but without that faction, you don't have that. And with the NWO, I mean, it was the biggest heel turn in history, right, with Hogan. Hogan came in, they thought he was just going to become champ, he was going to, stay face, Hulkamania all over again, and he turned and spray painted the belt, NWO, and basically people were ready to jump in the ring and kill him. I mean, that's how shocking it was that you had the biggest hero in the world go bad, and it was memorable, and it was one of those things that even till now, the Bullet Club goes off of them, right? So the Too Sweet. So when you go to a wrestling show now, you'll see people in the arena, they'll yell out, "Too sweet, wheat, too sweet, wheat." That's from NWO. Like, that was the Too Sweet. So you have all these other factions that are all basically doing what the NWO did first. And those four people, I don't think could have done it any better. With Bischoff being the arrogant, cocky, I'm going to come in, grab the microphone, tell you what we're going to do. And Hogan, Nash, and Scott Hall, I mean, obviously it turned into everybody and anybody was in the group. But those four guys, when they came out and they did it, it was like they hijacked wrestling, right? They took the show over. Hogan and Nash, when Hogan was in the ring and Kevin Nash and Scott Hall walked up to the WCW announcers and Eric Bischoff ripped the microphone out of Shivani's hands and says, "This is our show," and that's how they ended it. I don't think you had a better night in wrestling. In the history of wrestling, that probably was the one night that everyone was like, did that just really happen? Like, is this staged? Is this fixed? Is this... Nobody knew. And this is pre-internet era, so you're watching TV and it's live and you're like, what just happened? Like, you were like...
showed up, they were like, who's that? Like, oh,
right.
we know who that guy is. They couldn't call him Razor Ramon.
Right.
They couldn't call him Diesel.
Sure.
Everybody knew who he was, you know?
So I just think for that reason alone, they're obviously they're my number two, and I'm probably sure they're higher on his list. No, the Horsemen are number three, so it's kind of...
Yeah, I mean, like, NWO is my number one, DX is my number two. But what I wanted to say was funny. Kevin Nash did an interview because he has a show, Click This. He was saying that because they were all friends, it was basically Click North and Click South.
Right.
So they said, because they saying like they were sitting in a t-shirt store and they were saying like DX and NWO, and it's like, yeah, we're essentially both of these factions all in one. It's
Correct.
just in different.
So as you see it progress, it's kind of cool how wrestling works, because a decade later when they reformed DX, you had the DX guys wearing the NWO shirts because Nash and Hall were there, right? So you had the same 4 guys, basically Shawn Michaels and Triple H being DX, and you had Kevin Nash and Scott Hall being the NWO. And I'm sure that was probably a great time for them, because they're bouncing ideas back and forth off of each other, and the fans are none the wiser, right? We don't know that they're friends in real life. They're sticking to, they're in one organization, they're in the organization, they don't talk to each other, they hate each other. And now with the internet era, which we were talking about before the show went on, with the way that the Elite were with the Young Bucks saying, we're going to go live and we're going to show behind the stage, right? And I think we were talking about Jim Cornette and why he hates the Young Bucks, but I think that's the reason why, because the Young Bucks gave you a backstage pass into what was going on. They kind of were like the Oz of wrestling. They pulled the curtain back and were like, oh, well, these 4 guys are hanging out. You watch the wrestling show, those 4 guys are spitting on each other, hitting each other with baseball bats, swearing at each other, but now they're having a beer together. Like, it's like, how is that possible? Like, you hate them, but you're... So I think knowing now, then, how awesome would that have really been to be those 4 guys and say, well, you're going to do this, but we're going to do this. And they'd probably say, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And they're just doing it on each other's shows, like separate from each other. So, I mean, that's kind of where, it all breaks down. And then obviously, rolling into our conversation of, number 1, 2, and 3, James had Evolution on the list. Like the Horsemen, Evolution, Fortune, and TNA, with AJ Styles and they're all the same, right? They were just all iterations of the 4 Horsemen. Yeah. Wherever Flair was, they were the Horsemen. Wherever Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were, they were the NWO. And wherever Shawn Michaels and DX go, they were, or Shawn Michaels and Triple H, they were DX. So across platforms and across generations, that's who they're going to be. They're forever. Kevin Nash can come out and wear an NWO shirt right now, and like people will rant and rave because that's just what it is. So, I mean, Flair was the start of it. But, I mean, Flair mentored all these guys, right? Shawn Michaels and Triple H will tell you that if it wasn't for Ric Flair, they wouldn't be who they were. Right. So they all goes full circle with Ric Flair being at the helm of everything with the Horsemen. But in every iteration of a faction along the way, they've all been involved. So, like I said, our lists pretty much mirror each other, just in categories. But, I mean, you take one main character, it's the same across the board. They're the same characters, just in different personas in different times. But that's just kind of, how it was.
And I think with the NWO, like, they kind of Hulk Hogan almost tagged along with it, but then became the face of it, because it's like, because the idea, when Hogan turned heel, that was like the biggest thing in wrestling. It's funny he turned heel on Macho Man, because in previous iterations of wrestling, Macho Man always turned heel on Hogan.
Yeah, that was always,
So it's funny how he
the Mega Powers destroyed.
Right. So it's funny that Hogan leg drops Macho Man. It's like, got your back, bitch. It's like, yeah, and it's like, and when Hogan did that, like, that was, I didn't watch it live because I was like, I was in the wrestling, but I wasn't watching it. But I remember hearing somebody was like, yo, Hogan turned heel. I'm like, what? They say Hogan's a bad guy. And I'm like, get out of here. I'm like, he's still doing the same red and white shtick in WCW. Like, no, Hogan's a bad guy. So I turn on Nitro and I see the replay. I'm like,
and they,
I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, they took that's like Captain America turning heel, you know? Well, he did actually in the comics.
Right. Yeah. but James is right, because like when you watch that live on pay-per-view and you saw Hogan do what he did when he grabbed the belt and he spray painted an NWO, and you have basically the end of the show is Eric Bischoff saying there's a new world order of wrestling. That's how they cut that show. I think that next Monday Nitro, it was the highest viewership of any live television show ever. So you're talking, baseball games, boxing matches. More people tuned into that than any other previous in history to see what Hogan was going to do, because they were like, is this just a one-time thing, or is this, and Jimi Hendrix music hits and he comes out and cuts a promo and those 4 guys are standing in the ring. It was awesome. Like, I mean, I was, like I said, I think I was 13 years old when that happened, and that carried us through high school and college was NWO. Like, everybody had the shirts. Like, I mean, they sold more in
Popular wrestling
merchandise,
was
right?
once upon a
So,
time. Like wrestling was huge. Once
You
upon
know.
I think I looked up what was it, Hogan Andre on Saturday night's main event, and it was something like 15 million viewers watched that. Like, can you
Right.
imagine 15?
15 million,
Like
right.
that's like
You
Super
can't get-
Bowl numbers.
right.
15 million people watch. Now, granted,
Exactly.
that was the 80s, and it was only what 10 channels.
Right.
You know,
So it
in,
was-
in modern day, there's so much content everywhere from cable, internet, TV. But the idea of 15 million people to watch professional
Absolutely.
wrestling, that is insane.
Yeah.
You can't even dream of numbers like that now.
And now, and you're talking, when you look at the professional wrestling across the spectrum from in its start in the 50s to where it ends up now, you start to see, and again, we talk about Ric Flair, but I mean, if you watched his 30 for 30, how many people in professional sports do the woo, right? It's all over. It's, you have guys stating, I'm Rolex wearing, I'm jet flying, they're saying this in locker rooms, right? Sports guys are emulating this, right? I mean, you don't have Ric Flair, you don't have Conor McGregor, right?
the
So
Migos
you
did.
have these modern moguls of sports. Without Ric Flair, you don't have that.
Yeah, even the Migos, I think they did a song called Ric Flair Drip.
Right.
And they put him in the video.
Yeah, in the video, right? Yeah.
So it's like,
So,
yeah.
as cheesy as wrestling is to a lot of people, right? They're like, oh, it's fake.
some of
It's
these
this,
guys are
right?
cultural icons.
You look at what Ric Flair did in the late 70s and early 80s, and you look at your megastars now with how flamboyant they are and how flashy they are and how they dress and how they wear their Rolexes and they wear their watches and they wear their chains and they wear... Without Ric Flair, you don't have that. You don't have a modern athlete. They would just wear plain Jane suits like they normally would. They wouldn't wear fur coats. They wouldn't wear... You had that in a guy who was a wrestler, and you got to give credit where credit's due. Whether you hate wrestling professionally and say it's just cheesy, it's corny, it's fake, it's everything, but you have to appreciate it for what it is. And when you look at, like I said, the global icons now, your flashy, flamboyant people, and you look how they dress going into the boxing ring, or you look at how they go to a press conference, or you look how they go to a sporting event. I mean, look at, for example, I think he's maybe the number 1 or number 2 soccer player in the world now, but you look at Messi, right? Mm-hmm. When he goes into a thing, he's dressed out, right? He's suit, sport coat, shirt and tie, flashy chain, flashy watch. You don't have Ric Flair, you don't have that. He's going in jeans and a sweatshirt like everybody else does.
There's
right?
a journeyman welterweight in boxing right now named Blair the Flair Cobb.
Right.
And he comes out wooing.
So again, it's cultural, and again, you will see. I mean, Travis Kelce wooed at the Super Bowl, right? So whether you like Travis or you don't, or whether you like the Chiefs or don't, is irrelevant. But without wrestling, he doesn't do that, right? So those are things that you have now. Even again, George Kittle, he is a Penta fan, right? So him and Penta exchanged masks. He gave Penta a pair of cleats. Penta gave him a pair of masks and gloves. George Kittle wore the Penta gloves on Sunday with the 49ers. They were red and gold, and he put them together like Penta does, and it was his diagram just with the 49er colors.
That's cool.
So it transcends. So even if you're not a fan, or you might not agree with me and James's list, right? You might be old school, and you might say, well, if it wasn't for these guys, it wouldn't be... But
George Hackenschmidt.
but as far as like relevancy goes, right? You had guys before Flair. You had classy Freddie Blassie,
Buddy Rogers.
and you had who was the Playboy, right? Wasn't he
He's the
Playboy?
original Nature Boy.
The original Nature
Boy, Buddy
So
Rogers, yeah.
and then what did he change? He went to the Playboy though, right? Later on. Or was
No, Playboy was Buddy
that-
Landale?
I don't know. It could have been. But just in terms of like, obviously you emulate the guys that come before you, but the relevance in wrestling is undeniable. And that's why we did this faction, and I'm sure we'll get together and think of some more lists to come up with, because it's ever growing and it's ever changing. So what is popular now, in 3 years, you might talk about the bloodline as being great, but there might be something better that comes along, right? You might have another group or another, person. So it's cool that we can talk about this. And like I said, the hour went quick, right? Where we could talk for another hour and kind of end this. I'll have James back on, but, like I said, with the way that we kind of presented this, we didn't talk about it before. I was like, let's keep it organic, let's keep it natural, and then we'll go from there. And that's kind of how we offset everything for us. So James will definitely be back. There will be a part 2. You want to give everybody your number one more time, or do you want me to just pin it?
So yeah, I mean, if we wanted to reiterate, me being a Medicare agent, if you have friends, family that are around Medicare age, or if you're Medicare age yourself. And if you have questions, give me a call. I answer any questions. If I don't know the answer, I know where to find it, because I've been doing this for almost half a decade now. So yeah, like 414-998-3502. And that just, if you have any questions about Medicare, give me a call.
Awesome. And I will post it in the link, guys, and then this video will be posted up to YouTube in about an hour. It usually takes a little bit longer for them to download when they're longer segments, but if you didn't catch us live now, you can definitely catch the replay on YouTube. I will pin and post everything for James. Same with the Clubhouse. They sponsor today's show, so it's www.shoptheclubhs.com, or it's www.shoptheclubhs.co for accessories. The Clubhouse sponsored today's show, so if you like this sweatshirt or you want to get something similar to this, check them out. They have all of that. But with that being said, guys, we're going to wrap up the show. James was an awesome guest. I'm so glad to see him again, and we've been friends for a while, which is, distance has been a evil lurker over us, but we're gonna change that though. We will change that. We'll see more of James, more of us together, and we'll go from there. So thank you everybody for watching. All the links will be posted on here and on YouTube. The One Fun Guy podcast is the same across all the board. So YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, One Fun Guy podcast. You can find me everywhere. All these videos will be loaded to my YouTube. So if you liked this show and you followed, awesome. Thank you so much. If you could just take 30 seconds to subscribe to my YouTube channel, One Fun Guy podcast over there, we would be super appreciative. James, thanks for being a great guest. You were awesome. And there will definitely be a part 2 with James, whether we talk about wrestling or life or in general, maybe music or something like that. We have similar interests. We're the same mind in different bodies. So, we're kindred souls in that regard. So thank you guys all for joining One Fun Guy podcast across all the platforms. Thanks for liking, subscribing, and sharing. If you follow me, I'll follow you back on the platforms. Head over to my YouTube channel, One Fun Guy podcast, and this video will be posted there in about an hour. So thank you all for watching. We'll see you on the next one.